Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura McCulloch. I'm Regent of the Key Corner Chapter, National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm here today with additional daughters of our chapter, Beverlee Weatherly and Wanda Cox, who will be, along with me, presenting to you the lives and the stories of three women who served as patriots themselves during the American Revolution. Many people fail to realize that during the time of the American Revolution, thousands of women participated in and became a real part of the search for liberty that we finally found when we were victorious in the American Revolution. Today, Beverlee will be sharing the story of
Catherine Moore Barry,
and Wanda will share with you the story of
Betsy Griscom Ross.
And I will be portraying Mary Shirley McGuire, who was not only a patriot, but is the ancestor of one of our chapter members here. We look forward to sharing this with you as we further pursue the American Revolution experience.
Hello everyone. I'm so glad you could be here today. My name is Catherine Moore Barry, but you could call me Kate. I was born in 1752 in Ireland, and I was one of 10 children. King George from Great Britain gave my father a 300-acre land grant in the colony of South Carolina. Now, notice I said the colony of South Carolina because, of course, there were no states at that time. We were still under British rule, and we had to answer to King George and the lawmakers in Britain. Well, my family moved to South Carolina while I was still a child, and my father established a plantation there with the 300 acres. It grew from 300 acres to 3,600 acres, and the name of the plantation was Walnut Grove. I had a wonderful childhood there. My siblings and I could play together. I had a horse. We did all the fun things that kids could do, and it was a really good life. When I was only 15, I married Andrew Barry, and we moved just a couple of miles away from Walnut Grove and established our own home there. Well, it wasn't too many years after that when the colonies became unhappy with being ruled by Great Britain. We wanted to be able to make our own laws and elect our own officials. And so we began a fight for our independence. My husband joined the Continental Army. He became a captain in the Army, and I had a brother who also fought in the Revolution. I wanted to go and fight in the Revolution, but I had a child and I was not able to go to the battlefields. So I helped in other ways. I became a messenger, I became a guide, and a spy. I knew all of the back roads, I knew all of the Indian trails in the area, and I could move from area to area riding my horse, and no one suspected me of being a spy because I was a woman. But I could keep an eye on the going-ons of the British Army, how many men there were, what they were doing, if they had appeared that they were going to move to a different area, and I would report that back to the Continental Army. Well, in 1781, after the Revolutionary War had been going on for several years, I learned that General Cornwallis was sending a group of men under General Tarleton to South Carolina. The Revolution had not been going real well in the southern colonies for the American troops, and Great Britain wanted to divide the South from the North because they needed some of the commodities that we could produce in the South. They needed the indigo, the flax, the cotton, things that they could not grow in Great Britain. And so they thought if they separated the South from the North and they could defeat the South, then they would have access to those crops. Well, as I said, he sent a general whose last name was Tarleton towards South Carolina, and he had 1,100 men. Well, I needed to let General Daniel Morgan, who was over the colonial army in our area, I needed to let him know about that because he didn't have an army of that size. He only had about 600 men. So I was home by myself. I had no one to leave my 2-year-old daughter with, so I tied her to the bedpost, and so that she could not wander away and get hurt, because I certainly couldn't take her with me. I tied her to the bedpost. I went out and I saddled my horse, and I rode all through the territory saying, "The British are coming, the British are coming. Get your arms, meet General Morgan." And when I got through riding through the territory and alerting all of the people, the militia, General Morgan ended up having 1,600 men instead of only 600. So General Morgan and his men marched to Cowpens, which became a famous and very important battle in the Revolutionary War. They marched to Cowpens and they met General Tarleton and his men, and the Americans thoroughly defeated the British. The British had to retreat. They went back through North Carolina to Virginia, and we won the Battle of Cowpens. And that was really kind of a turning point in the Southern campaign of the Revolution. After that, we began to win more battles, and it was just a turning point, and we were able to have more victories down there. I became known as the heroine of Cowpens, and they even gave me a medal for my part in this dangerous mission. Well, when the war was finally over and the Americans won, we went back to our plantation, and my husband and I resumed our lives there, and we lived out the rest of our lives on the plantation. I died in 1823, and I was buried in the family cemetery at Walnut Grove beside my husband. My home today is open to the public, and you can go there and visit it and see where I lived and how I lived. And I hope you will do that. It's close to Spartanburg, South Carolina. So if you ever go there and visit my home, be sure and stop by the Walnut Grove Cemetery and visit with me. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I come to you today from the front porch of my home in Tennessee, Bedford County, Tennessee to be exact. And I lived in this place called Horse Mountain in Bedford County, Tennessee until my death in 1845. I lived here with my husband, and we had a simply splendid life until 1845, of course, when things sort of went south, because now we're both buried in the Horse Mountain Cemetery to this day. And a historical marker marks our home and lets everyone who comes by know that the McGuires lived here and raised 8 children right here in Tennessee. But that's not where our story began. Our story began when I was born in 1762 in the western part of what was known then as the colony of Virginia. I lived there with my parents and 7 other siblings. There were a lot of us. And my father was given the opportunity to move to a wild new country called the Kentucky Territory and survey the property there. He worked as a surveyor. It seemed like a wonderful opportunity for our family, so he loaded us up with Mother, and off we went. We ended up at a new settlement called Fort Boonesboro, where the famous Daniel Boone was residing, and beginning what would become one of the earliest settlements in Kentucky. My father's job was to leave the fort and go survey all the land around the fort so that new settlers could buy property in Kentucky. One day he left, and when his time to come home came, he didn't return. We waited, and he didn't return. And we waited several more days, and he didn't return. Weeks after he had departed from the fort, he was found rather far away with his surveying equipment laying around him. He had been attacked and killed by Native Americans who had never been particularly pleased that we were coming into their territory. In a particularly sad ending, he had notched a tree that was close by to where he was found, showing us how many days he had laid there hoping someone would come along and find him. It was a terrible time. And my siblings and I really thought that Mother would load everybody back up and we would head back to Virginia, where her family and my father's family lived. But that was not to be the case. We misjudged our mother completely because she decided to stay in Kentucky. She purchased land from Daniel Boone. And if you were to go to the Fort Boonesboro Museum today, you would see hanging there on the wall the land deed that both Daniel Boone and my mother signed when she bought land from him. So we stayed there in Fort Boonesboro. We didn't know what the future held for us, but we were making our life there as best we could. And then one day, some soldiers came. It was 1775, and we had heard on the Kentucky frontier that there might be a war. We didn't get a lot of information, and we weren't particularly worried about a war with Britain. We were busy just trying to stay alive. But the soldiers came, and I met a very dashing soldier named William McGuire. He was 30. I was 13. But I still managed to catch his eye. And 3 years later, when I was 16, we were married at Fort Boonesboro. A lot of people thought I was out of my mind marrying a man that was so much older than me. But he was by then a soldier in the Continental Army. He had excellent prospects. He had some property, and he was from a good family. And I had 7 other siblings. So I married William, and we made the move to a place called Martin's Station. My husband's sister, Christina, was there, and she was married to the gentleman who was captain of the militia at Martin's Station. That sounds very important, and actually it was, and it did give William a great deal of job security. And to be honest, we weren't very concerned about war at Martin's Station. Why would the British care about what was happening in Kentucky? So life was good. The men didn't have to go out and fight. They just went out and looked around every couple of days to make sure there weren't any British soldiers close. Everybody came home. We had our first child, a little boy named Michael. Then we found out that while we had been enjoying this perfect life at Martin's Station in Kentucky, a British officer whose last name was Byrd had made the decision all the way up at Fort Detroit to come south. It was his objective to push all the colonial settlers back across the Appalachian Mountains. He wanted all of us in one place, so it made the war easier to fight. There would be no Western front to this war. And so he headed south. And along the way, he added 1,000 Native Americans to his fighting force. We had a storm headed our way, and we didn't even know it was coming. In June, we were surprised to find out, as survivors fled Ruddle's Fort just down the river from us, that the British and their Native American troops had attacked there. They had tried to surrender. The British Officer Byrd had accepted their surrender. And then some of the troops, they lost control of them and they rushed the fort and they killed hundreds of men, women, children, their livestock. It was a massacre. Wisely, my brother-in-law, my husband, and the other men at Martin's Station determined that it would be in our best interest to surrender before they even arrived and work out some kind of reasonable surrender and hope for better circumstances. So that's exactly what they did. And we did surrender, but still, over 150 people were killed. When all was said and done, those of us that lived and surrendered were marched out of Kentucky as prisoners of the British. My husband and I and our little 2-year-old son, Michael, were marched on foot all the way to Fort Detroit. It was 500 miles. I know you ladies think traveling in a vehicle with a toddler is difficult. Imagine walking 500 miles. We were given very few provisions. We wore out our shoes. We wore out our clothes. We marched in rain, snow, heat. It didn't matter. Many of our group died along the way from disease and injury, and they were just allowed to fall along the wayside, only to find that Fort Detroit had no room for us. So those of us that were able were sent to Montreal, another 500 miles. Fortunately, part of that was done by boat, and we didn't have to walk. And we survived the journey, all 3 of us. Conditions were better at Montreal. We got food. We had a place to live. In fact, my husband and I and Michael were allowed to go work on a farm. And that was much better because we always had food. We stayed there for 2 years, working as prisoners of the British. And then in 1782, as the tide was turning against Great Britain in the war, we were traded in a prisoner exchange and given the opportunity to leave. We gathered in a group, and surprisingly enough, there was no transportation for us. We were told we had to walk out. And so my husband William and I and Michael, and now our child Thomas, who had been born while we were in prison, started the long walk home to Kentucky. The British soldiers stayed with us as we crossed from Montreal back into America. And when we finally got to the fort where the exchange was to take place, we were so relieved. We thought, oh, we're finally going to be in out of the cold. It was November. It was cold. We had very little clothing, no shoes. But the British soldiers said the fort was too full and they wouldn't let us in. So we spent that last night in a cemetery on the ground. It was snowing, it was cold. I could tuck baby Thomas up under my skirts to keep him warm, and our son Michael, who is now 4 years old, laid between us on the ground. When William and I woke the next morning, we had lost Michael during the night. He had frozen to death. The British soldiers told us to get up. We had to get moving. So in the little time we had, William and I scraped a grave in the snow in the cemetery, and we left behind our precious baby boy. We entered the fort finally and were transported by the British soldiers to General Washington's headquarters, which were very close. And we were met by the Continental Army. General Washington welcomed us himself and invited all of us to eat with him that night. We had that honor. But then the next day, we were waved goodbye, wished well, given some provisions, and told we could go home. And we did. Michael was left behind. Thomas and William and I continued our journey and walked back to Virginia. We did have people take pity on us along the way and offer us rides in wagons or on a flatboat or whatever they had. We made it back to our family. And as funny as it sounds, life went on. What else do you do? The war came to an end. William received his pay for his service. We eventually had 7 more children. And one day, William McGuire came home and said we were moving. We did eventually move back to Kentucky, and then from Kentucky to Bedford County, Tennessee, where we remained for the rest of our lives. So, when you talk about the Revolutionary War and the men who fought and the people who made a difference, I beg you, as a mother, as a wife and a woman, to remember that women did their part. I served my country. I sacrificed for this country too. Now, many know my story. My ancestors tell it, and there's a historical marker at Horse Mountain in Bedford County, Tennessee, to remind everyone of Mary Shirley McGuire. Thank you.
I'm here to speak about Betsy Griscom Ross. When we view the flag, we think of liberty, freedom, pride, and Betsy Ross. The American flag flies on the moon, sits on top of Mount Everest, is hurling out in space. The flag is how America signs her name. It is no surprise that Betsy Ross has become one of the most cherished figures of American history. In 1680, Betsy Ross's great-grandfather, a Quaker carpenter, immigrated from England to New Jersey. He was a firm Quaker and moved to Philadelphia, purchasing 495 acres. His son and grandson both became respected carpenters. His grandsons Samuel and Rebecca James Griscom, Betsy's parents, had 17 children, of which one was Elizabeth Griscom, also called Betsy. She was the 8th child of a 4th-generation American and was born on January 1st, 1752. The same year Betsy was born was the year the Liberty Bell arrived in Philadelphia. Her father had the honor of assisting in building the tower that surrounded the bell where it was placed. Betsy went to Quaker school. For 8 hours a day, she was taught reading, writing, and received instructions in a trade. Her father apprenticed her to a local upholsterer, which included all types of sewing jobs. Betsy fell in love with another apprentice, John Ross, whose father was an Episcopal rector at Christ Church. Quakers did not like their members to marry non-Quakers. The penalty was severe, meaning that they were cut off emotionally and economically from both family and Quaker meeting house. However, 21-year-old Betsy eloped with John Ross. They were married in New Jersey. Her wedding split the family. Betsy had been expelled from the Quaker congregation. She was no longer a Quaker, instead sitting in pew 12 of Christ Church with her husband. George Washington often sat at the next pew. The couple started their own upholstery business. Husband John joined the Philadelphia militia while guarding ammunition in January 1776. He was killed by an explosion and was buried at Christ Church Cemetery. Betsy returned to the Quaker fold, where the Quakers were pacifists and forbidden to bear arms. However, fighting Quakers band together and Betsy joined them. Betsy married again in June 1777 to Sea Captain Joseph Ashburn. During the winter of 1777, Betsy was forced to share her house with British soldiers who occupied Philadelphia. Philadelphians were enraged that they had to share their homes with the British. Her husband went to the West Indies to procure war supplies for the Revolution cause and was captured by the British. He was sent to Old Mill Prison in England, where he died in March 1782. Betsy married again, convincing her new husband to abandon his life at sea and work in her upholstery business. Her new husband, John Claypool, had grown up with Betsy in the Philadelphia Quaker community and had been imprisoned in England with her second husband, Ashburn. John and Betsy had 5 daughters. Over the next decade, Betsy and her daughters sewed upholstery and made flags, banners, and standards for the new nation. She repaired curtains, tablecloths, bed covers, and rugs. She was very skilled in being an upholsterer and seamstress. She was a prominent early American flag maker who stitched flags for the federal government for over 50 years. She made 6 28 by 24 foot garrison flags, which were sent to New Orleans. She also made 27 flags for the Indian Department. In 1811, she made over 50 garrison flags for the U.S. Arsenal in New York. Betsy died at the age of 84 on January 30th, 1836. She had lost her eyesight. She had 7 children, of which 7 lived to adulthood. She outlived her husband, 3 husbands. 2 years before Betsy's death, there were only 2 free Quakers attending the meeting house. It was decided to close the meeting house. At the last meeting, Betsy watched as the door was locked, symbolizing the end of an era. She has been buried in 3 different locations: Free Quaker Burial Ground. Then 20 years later, her remains were moved to Mount Moriah Cemetery. And in 1975, her remains were moved to the courtyard adjacent to the Betsy Ross House. The Betsy Ross House is a landmark in Philadelphia, located several blocks from the Independent Hall and the Liberty Bell. Betsy was a hardworking, brave, independent, and forward-thinking businesswoman. She is credited with sewing the first U.S. flag. She is often celebrated as the woman who helped George Washington finish the design. The flag is now called the Betsy Ross flag, has a circle of 13 5-pointed stars and a blue patch on the top left corner, 13 alternating red and white stripes cut horizontally through the rest of the cloth. The stripes represented the 13 colonies. Betsy suggested that the original 6-point star be changed to a 5-pointed star because it was easier to make by folding a piece of paper into triangles, and with single nip of the scissors, she made a perfect star. The Continental Congress called for such a flag on June 14, 1777. The connection of Betsy Ross to the first flag was not known to the American public for nearly 100 years, until her grandson told the story in 1870 to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. No historical records or documents could be found to verify his claims. Instead, he got his family members to sign legal documents stating that Betsy also told them the same story. A major Philadelphia bridge over the Delaware River is named in her honor. The Betsy Ross stamp was issued to celebrate the 200-year anniversary of her birth. It featured an image of Betsy and the flag in her lap. Her words say it all: our hearts aching, our prayers praying, our flags waving. Never forget.